We're about to take a trip here. A trip that took me months and months of nights and weekends to assemble. We're about to go into one of the most chaotic, influential, and frankly bizarre lives in drag racing history. The life of a man who created an industry within an industry, and one he could have dominated to the point of obscene riches, but one that he not only failed to advance in, but self-sabotaged his own future in. A brilliant mind, a big mouth, and the unique ability to make enemies at the highest levels of a sport he was just starting to dominate. You have heard of Scotty Fenn if you love drag racing history. You have heard of his company, Chassis Research. But what you have not heard is the whole story of how it started, how it ended, and how absolutely weird all of it is. His real name was Gordon Alfred Fenn. Everybody called him Scotty. You're going to learn the whole story, but we'll take a minute to get through all of it. And for starters, we have to go back to Wisconsin in 1920. That's where Gordon Alfred Fenn came from. He was born to an interesting mom and dad. His father ran a farm and was also an engineer of sorts. He oversaw highway projects and other civil-type enterprises. Now, little is known about his parents, and frankly, that isn't much part of the story we're here for anyway, but suffice it to say that young Mr. Fenn got a farm boy's education in mechanics and solving problems, which, as we all know, is invaluable. We jump to 1948. World War II has been over for a couple of years, and hope is eternal all over the United States. In July of 1948, we see the first mention of our hero in the newspaper. It has nothing to do with racing, but rather it's this announcement that he's getting engaged to be married to a woman in New York. If you're wondering how, of all the people in New York City, we can claim that this is our Gordon Alfred Fenn, it is the callback in this engagement announcement to his mom and dad's name. That ties him in as being the guy that would eventually change drag racing history. The announcement makes mention that he is in the Army and he lives in Brooklyn. He was likely stationed there for some reason, but otherwise, life is good. 1 month and 5 days later, we see this marriage announcement to a different woman in Hawaii, thousands of miles away from the engagement announcement to a totally different woman in New York City. 4 months and 6 days after the Hawaiian marriage announcement, there is a birth announcement in that same Hawaiian newspaper announcing that Staff Sergeant Alfred Fenn and his wife Jean have had a boy named Rock Kenneth. And this is when we really start to understand that Alfred Gordon, Scotty Fenn, is not a normal guy. 5 months after he was engaged to a woman in New York, he was married and having a baby with a woman in Hawaii. Alrighty then. In early 1949, the name Gordon Fenn begins to appear in Honolulu newspapers attached not to a race car, not to a hot rod shop, not to motorsports at all. His name is attached to an artist colony. Not just as a member, but Gordon Alfred Fenn was the president of the Waikiki Artist Colony. Fenn was praised as being a great painter, and all the more incredible, he repeatedly told reporters that he was colorblind and used other senses in order to feel the colors he was using. As we'll soon learn, even when things favored Scotty Fenn in life, he always had to take a plot twist and add something to make them seem more amazing. The work was so well recognized that it was on public display and received strong reviews. Many popularity votes from the Hawaiian public that have visited his galleries and displays voted on it and enjoyed it. Yes, this is the same guy who would revolutionize the drag racing chassis industry. Oh, he's the guy in the back of this photo with his hands in his pockets on the right. Weirdly enough, not a single image of his art appears along with any stories praising it in the papers, and there are many, many stories of such in 1949. In March of 1950, the Army Staff Sergeant Scotty Fenn and his wife welcomed a daughter who they named Leilani. There is little of no record of Fenn's life on Hawaii from this point until late of October 1952, when judicial notices are posted that he and his wife Jean are placing a child up for adoption. The child's name was Craig Fenn. A judge was determining the fitness of the potential new parents to receive the child. I could find no birth records of Craig and have no other history. But it's too far a coincidence that the names would line up like this in Hawaii and it wouldn't be the same people. So there we are. This will be one of a few unanswerable questions in this video. As you have likely surmised, we're already dealing with a pretty interesting character here, but little did the world know what was coming next. While he'd claim later in life to have owned a parts store and been racing in Hawaii, there's no evidence that I could find to support this. It doesn't mean that he was full of it, but as we'll learn in the coming minutes, Alfred Gordon, Scotty Fenn, and the truth sometimes had a funny relationship. Having led an artist colony and served in the U.S. Army, Fenn, in the 1952 timeframe, moved his family from Hawaii to California and opened a business called Experimental Automotive. The longest-standing location of this company was in Bellflower, California, and it would become a successful engine-building operation, specializing in the kinds of flathead Ford builds that dominated hot rodding, drag racing, and land speed racing at the time. Their name appeared on land speed cars at Bonneville, drag racing cars, and their ads were seen in magazines and papers across the country. The legendary Jocko Johnson claimed later in his life that after being hired in 1953, it was Scotty Fenn who taught him how to port cylinder heads at Experimental Automotive. Jocko would, of course, go on to a lifetime of amazing projects in the exploration of wild ideas, and he operated his own head-porting business with near international acclaim for decades. And Scotty got him started. Experimental's seemingly big break came in January 1955 when an issue of Hot Rod magazine was published with a feature inside written and photographed by Eric Rickman. The name of the story was A Dyno the Hard Way. This was an incredible look at an engine dyno that Fenn had made from a pile of junk parts, airplane bearings, and welded together scrap. The whole contraption and its description is nearly beyond belief. I've read the story multiple times, and while all the words make sense, the practice of this thing in construction, as well as the lack of any evidence that it actually worked, has left me with questions. It was also the first waypoint in Scotty Fenn's life marked by a dyno. Remember it. 2 more of these would haunt him later on. This thing was literally made of old truck parts that Scotty had cleaned up and welded angle iron to. He made his own water brake. All of it was pretty wild, and in the story there was never any evidence of it actually being used in practice, but a lot of it sounded pretty good in theory. Now, there are some dots in this story that I cannot connect, and it's here that I have to actually admit that. I have no idea how the artist colony president and staff sergeant in the Army turned into a race engine builder, a dyno constructor, and a self-proclaimed engineer to the public. Now, there's no means to explain it. That said, it was an identity that Scotty Fenn would carry forward. Far, far forward. During the waning days of Experimental Automotive in 1956, Scotty Fenn did something new. He followed through on an idea that he'd been kicking around for some time. It was something he had talked to customers about, he had drawn up and dreamed over, and he finally put a welder to pipe. He built a dragster. The customer was Lou Bainey. Bainey's name is synonymous to the growth and explosion in popularity of drag racing in Southern California during the 1950s and 60s. He was a huge supporter of the sport, and he was, in fact, the general manager of Yackel Cadillac, one of a couple of dealerships that the Yackel brothers owned at that time. Bainey and the Yackel brothers had planned on putting a hot-rodded Cadillac engine in the car and taking it on tour, and that's exactly what they did. They ran this car all over the place, including the NHRA Nationals in 1956. But shortly thereafter building the chassis, Scotty Fenn skipped town. Why? I wish I knew, but I'm guessing business wasn't great, the dyno never worked, and the pressure was catching up to him. Where did he land? A sports car dealership in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Turns out they had a salesman up front named Carroll Shelby. Tulsa Sports Cars hired Fenn as their high-performance car specialist. He did tune-ups and hop-ups and whatever else customers needed to make their sports car or other car run better. He had been there a few months when a story pops up on the Tulsa Tribune, February 11th, 1957. It reads, quote, Scotty Fenn, the hop-up expert who holds forth at Tulsa Sports Cars, has added another laurel to his already imposing list. A dragster which he built the chassis for set a world's record at Long Beach, California a week ago Sunday by hitting 166.97 miles per hour at the end of a quarter-mile acceleration run. If that doesn't impress you, look at it this way. A hot production car will reach the higher 70s in the same distance, which means the Dragon machine rambles more than twice as fast. The car also set a record for the strip with an elapsed time of 9.28 seconds for the quarter-mile speed. The mile per hour in ET on the 6 runs were 156.25 and 9.28 seconds, 157.06 and 9.64 seconds, 158.17 and 9.72, 159.01 at 9.88, 165.13 at 9.80, and finally 166.97 in 10.06 seconds. Notice that as the top speeds increase, so do the elapsed times, and this is because the gear ratio on the earlier runs favored acceleration, while later it was changed to give top speed. The record-breaking car was driven by Emery Cook. Fenn, a comparatively recent Tulsa resident, built the chassis while he still lived in California. He was notified of the feat by Ed Iskandarian, who supplied the camshaft for the car's Chrysler engine. Fenn and Eddie Garrett, also a Tulsa sports car mechanic, are building another dragster which he predicts will be better than the Cook machine. Garrett will drive the car at the local strip and in the national championships to be held at Oklahoma City next Labor Day. We had a look at the car last week, and it's full of unique ideas. Car Corner will carry a complete story when the dragster is completed." End quote. Well, it is very true that the famed Cook and Bedwell team started with what history now knows as the former Yakel Cadillac car, and by virtue of that, the very first TE-440, meaning top eliminator 440 yards, chassis that Fenn would ever build. When they ran the record numbers, the car had been vastly changed and reworked. But Fenn was no dummy. He knew that he could seize on this situation, and he did. The 166.97 mile-an-hour Cook and Bedwell run is still one of the most important in drag racing history. It actually spurred track operators in Southern California to jump onto what we now call the nitro ban. But aside from all this, Fenn had already convinced management at the Tulsa sports car dealership that they needed to go into the dragster business, as well as producing a bunch of specialized parts for the cars as well. This interview and the acknowledgement that he had built their car originally certainly allowed dealership management to understand that they had the right guy for the job if they were going to go drag racing. Now, as mentioned in the story, he was already most of the way through building a car that they called Damn Yankee when this story came out. A month later, the car was done. By this time, the Tulsa sports car dealership had started buying advertisements in the Drag News newspaper, advertising the fact that complete dragsters could be bought from their dealership and built and shipped from in-house. As you may have noticed, some of the ads actually promised a dyno that no doubt Scotty Fenn had promised to build for the dealership. That's number 2. As promised, the newspaper went back to the dealer when the Damn Yankee car was finished and running down the drag strip. There happens to be a lot of critical information in the story here, and it's useful for our timeline. But there's also lots of insanity that we need to cover to get the full picture on Scotty Fenn. The story, which was published in March of 1957, tells the tale of the car's build and its lofty performance goals, which of course were to blow the numbers Cook and Bedwell had put up on the board straight out of the water. In the story, Fenn is described as an intense man and someone who is fully invested into the car in emotional ways. It then proceeds to relay this incredible story that Fenn told a reporter regarding his World War II service. Quote, "Some definite clues to this can be found in Fenn's adventuresome life. Before World War II, he had a fling at midget racing in the East and also did juvenile delinquency work with the New York City Police Department. When war threatened, he joined the paratroopers and was sent to the Pacific. During a drop in the Philippines, a miscalculation sent him behind Japanese lines. He was seriously wounded by machine gun fire and captured. The Japanese hauled him into an interrogation session, but when he didn't give them any information, he was shot in the head, his throat cut, and he was left to die in the jungle. Huck guerrillas found him, treated his wounds, and finally helped him return to the U.S. lines. He was discharged as a staff sergeant and settled in Honolulu, where he opened a shop to do speed work and engage in racing himself. He tired of the trophies and returned to the States. His next venture was in Los Angeles, where he opened Experimental Motors, another hop-up shop. This business flourished for several years, during which cars he prepared or built set 22 records, including one world's mark at Bonneville." End quote. This is an astonishing story, a fantastical story, a life-defining story. And Scotty Fenn told it exactly once. And he told it only to this reporter from the automotive section of a Tulsa newspaper. No one that ever worked for him, with him or knew him, has ever mentioned it since. A man who would later become a pro-level braggart, this story, if it were valid, would have been his calling card for life. Instead, it was never spoken of again. Through my own research, no one named Fenn was reported captured or missing in this manner in the war in the Pacific Theater. There's another tell that Scotty was creative with his own life story. It's more subtle, but in this story he says he was sent home and discharged as a staff sergeant in Hawaii. Well, we've already established that he was in New York and engaged to a woman long before he got to Hawaii. Well, he did leave the service in Hawaii. There's reason to believe he was likely never a paratrooper, nor perhaps ever in the theater of combat of the South Pacific. Stories like this one got people medals and decorations, not sent home and discharged with a pat on the head. Fenn had a knack for omissions and embellishments in stories that he'd used his whole life. Also, the reason he gave for leaving California for Tulsa is pretty wild, even for 1957. In the same interview, quote, "But last year the smog evicted Fenn and his family from Los Angeles. One day I noticed my entire family, including myself, was coughing, so we decided it was time to leave. With his wife, Son age 9 and daughter 3, he started eastward, looking for a friendly spot to continue his work. When we got to Tulsa, we were impressed by the friendly atmosphere and the cleanliness. The first person I talked to happened to be a couple of car fans, and they convinced me I should stay. End quote. I'm all for interesting stories, and I'm also all for trying to figure people and things out, and this one is beyond me. In an amazing age before the internet or any real-time tracking, when you wanted to leave a place and start somewhere new, you carried your toolbox, you kept your secrets, and you moved to a new city. Smog? In 1957, I'm sure there was some, but enough to cause your whole family to be hacking and coughing to move everybody out of town and halfway across the United States? Hardly. A shop that was probably failing and financially in trouble? Way, way more likely. 2 months later, the boys with the Tulsa dragster were back in the newspaper, and this was not for the reasons they wanted. The car was wrecked at a race on April 28th, leaving them with weeks of repair work. Sure, that work probably kept Scotty Fenn busy for a short time, but remember the smog problem? It must have lifted. Scotty Fenn was headed back to California. Tulsa was fun and all, but Scotty knew where the money was. In looking at the larger picture, it seems that Fenn totally used Tulsa Sports Car to prove out a business model for what he wanted to do himself. Not only building the chassis, but supplying many of the parts to finish the car was the ticket to make real money. The dealer actually saw his vision and went in on it. Without any personal risk to himself, Fenn saw the whole operation and how it worked. In fact, he helped perfect it. He also had all the names for the part suppliers and the pieces they were using. If Fenn's dragster chassis factory concept would work in 1956 and 1957 Tulsa, it would most assuredly work in the sport's blast furnace of competition, Southern California. By late 1957, Fenn's name was appearing in drag news again. Not the Tulsa dealer's name, his name. And not for chassis, but for mixing fuel, which was its own insane chemistry fun at the time. Witch's brews of nitromethane, propylene oxide, and other stuff were hand-mixed for racers in small batches. Without a documented stitch of education on the subject, Fenn wasn't only an engineer, he was a chemist now too. According to the man himself, the date was January 15, 1958, when the first completed assembly line TE440 chassis was built in a small one-car garage in Downey, California. This was a car that would forever change drag racing as a sport and the industry that supports it. As the cars trickled out of that small shop in 1957, Fenn poured every dime he had into advertising, and it was not like anybody else's. The ads were brash and taunting and somewhat insulting. The ads goaded, implored, and sometimes seemed to shame potential customers into buying a chassis. Fenn's one-man garage operation turned into a small shop with a few employees, and as volume increased, the numbers of customers lined up with money in hand did exponentially as well. The problem was not finding customers. The problem was turning out cars quick enough to keep the line moving. According to Fenn, his place was so small, the first order of business each morning was pushing half the materials and unneeded tools outside to give them working room inside. Working 12 to 14-hour days, Fenn and his small band of fabricators in their little shop sent about 100 cars out the door in 1958, which was absolutely incredible for so many different reasons. The first was that not only did the cars get to the customers, when they were finished, they won. And they won a lot. It is not a stretch to say that at this time in history, chassis research was the de facto leader in chassis technology and drag racing. The majority of cars in this sport at its top levels were homemade experiments in these times. So to have something this professional, clean, and proven in your hands was a leg up for any racer. Perhaps the competition was weak or even non-existent, but Scotty Fenn owned the sport, and he was on the move again. This time it was a short move. A large industrial space was located in Inglewood, California, and it was in this building that the truly great days of chassis research would take place. He expanded his staff, employing a bunch of welders, staffing a full machine shop, a shipping department, and more. The place was a legitimate dragster factory. From bare frames to complete rollers, they were cranking these cars out. And according to Fenn, they produced nearly 800 chassis the following year in the new shop. While some were mystified by the success of Fenn, he had been an absolutely brilliant planner. The man foresaw a market for safe, easy-to-complete, relatively cheap cars to go drag racing in. He had, advertently or not, created a totally new segment in the drag racing industry, and he was the man on top of it. The true world's authority. His advertising reflected his growth, his confidence, his power, and his unique personality. In a sea of home-built oddballs, chassis research cars looked far more professional, they worked more consistently. Racers like Ted Sear, Chris Karamessinis, and hundreds of others set records and won big-name races in chassis research pipe. In today's world, we have influencers. In 1959, you had the same thing, but it was done with different tools. When the Sear and Hopper team roared to high-profile wins in their TE440, they were featured in magazines and newspapers all over the country, and the chassis research phone did not stop ringing. Fenn also took this opportunity to expand his chassis line. In 1959, he added the K88 middle eliminator model, which was designed as an even less expensive version of the TE440 and was sold for less than $200 as a fully finished welded bare chassis. Secondarily, he released the R16 Roadster chassis, and this was designed for the short wheelbase Roadster category cars as well as altereds. Both chassis were immediate hits, and both of them proved once again that Fenn had a consistent, proper design that went straight and was comparatively safe, especially when lined up next to machines that were being gas welded together with coat hangers in somebody's mom and dad's garage. When your competition is made of muffler tubing based on garage floor chalk lines, and you have professional fabricators, jigs, and an assembly line, you best be the class of the field, right? But Scotty Fenn, despite all his success, was annoyed. And all his annoyance was being focused in the direction of one man, and that man just so happened to be the most authoritative figure in the world of drag racing, and his name was Wally Parks. There's no real telling as to what the heck happened to set Scotty Fenn's intense personality and attitude against Wally Parks, but once he made the decision he was going to be the spokesman for the industry through ever more incendiary ads, verbiage, and messaging, he went all in. If Scotty Fenn lived in the modern world or had social media existed in the late 50s and early 60s, this man would have been a rock star. He was brash, opinionated, and unafraid to say anything, anytime, to anyone. He was made for the modern world of he who yells loudest wins. Fenn would buy these huge ads in drag news, sometimes a full page, and address letters to Wally Parks. He'd explain how jacked up the rules were, how he'd been wronged and ignored by the NHRA. Famously, he bought a full-page drag news ad with the main question being, "Nonprofit for who?" in reference to the NHRA's nonprofit status. Other questions like, what's going to happen to the safety factor when the fuel boys put two mills together? And on and on. Fenn was sounding alarms that made a lot of sense to him, certainly got racers whipped up, but in reality were not the prime issues the sport was trying to face. Both the K88 and TE440 were sold either with straight parallel frame rails or frame rails that pinched down to the center and came to a point in the front of the car. Now, at the time being, because so many strips were so rough, all cars and even dragsters were required to have a front suspension. For the pinch-railed cars, Fenn came up with something he called the Pion front end. This was an interesting take in making the lightest possible sprung axle, and there was no specific rules given on what constituted a front suspension, so he made up his own. The way this worked is there were two large steel cups in the center of the front axle, which acted as an inner and outer tube like a shock absorber. The inner tube was filled with rubber biscuits, which were supposedly the radiator isolators from GM X-frame cars of the day. With a bolt running between them to keep stuff together, this was the Pion concept. It was a large and really rudimentary type of snubber shock arrangement in the front of the car. The NHRA outlawed it very quickly, saying that it did not qualify as a front suspension and frankly was dangerous because the whole thing could break off the front of the car. This didn't sit well with Scotty Fenn, as you can imagine. In 1959, Fenn also made a massive road trip, claimed to have driven through 38 states and over 18,000 miles to meet racers and see his equipment in action at events and strips all over the nation. The results were his doubling down on attitudes regarding strip operators, sanctioning bodies, and how his cars were built. To Scotty, the racer was the man in the ring, fueled by his passion and curiosity. The strip operators and sanctions, basically to him anyway, existed to rob these people and pillage them. His cars were everywhere. And while there were some small companies competing, from the new Dragmaster company of Jim Nelson and Dode Martin, as well as back east from Pat Bilbo's Linwood Welding Company, he really did own the market, and there was no sign that was going to change anytime soon. 1960 was the year that Scotty Fenn peaked in so many ways. The shop had some of the best welders and racers in the business making chassis on a production line style program. Over the years, guys like Goob Tuller, who drove the freight train, Roger Wolford, a great funny car racer and longtime competitor, Bob Kraus, Roy Fiested, and others worked as welders for Scotty Fenn, some for a very short time and some for a longer time. Along with the chassis themselves, the componentry business was absolutely wild for this time. The amount of stuff that the manufacturing end of that company was taking care of and machining was really enough to blow anybody else out of the water. The cars were racing all over the country, winning everything in sight, setting every record in sight as well, including the biggest one of the era. Yes, Chris Karamessinis, when he made the most controversial run in drag racing history, cracking a 204-mile-an-hour speed at Alton, Illinois in 1960, was in a chassis research dragster. Never one to miss an opportunity, Fenn jumped right on the promotion of this run. Although he would have his own interesting relationship with drag racing speeds in the coming years, this 204 was a big deal at the time. A Southern California team running the Albertson Olds dragster driven by Leonard Harris took one of his cars and it ran very well. But when they modified the chassis for header clearance by removing the smaller top rail of it, the machine became an unbeatable monster. Fenn was furious they had dared to alter his chassis, but week after week, for nearly 3 months straight, the Albertson Olds was undefeated at Lions Associated Drag Strip. Between their driver Leonard Harris and a chassis modification that seemingly allowed the ultra-stiff car to actually flex and work better, no one could touch them. Speaking to his personality, Fenn refused to acknowledge or glorify the fact they had modified his car and made it better. It was to him a personal insult that anyone would hack up one of his chassis in a seeming effort to make the car go faster. After all, he was the, quote, engineer, right? At least in his own mind he was. It was also about this time that a couple of the flaws that would sink Scotty Fenn's business began to show themselves. Customers who called up or came into the shop to order a car like the Albertson Olds was modified were shouted out or hung up on. Customers who wanted to have the wheelbase of their K88 or TE440 extended beyond the norm met the same fate. They were marched out the door or simply hung up on. Fenn was a man of strong beliefs in his own theories, which were rooted in, well, his own theories. Unwilling or unable to release the details of his genius, Fenn took a largely Henry Ford-style approach, and he offered his cars as they were, and that's how they came. There were no a la carte options if you wanted to alter the chassis. In fact, if you screwed with them after the fact, you were basically dead to him. But the sport was starting to change underneath his feet. Now here we should stop and examine the most famous theory that Fenn developed in his own mind for his own reasons. One that Fenn never really explained his reasoning for in public and perhaps in private as well, but that was his staunch belief that a dragster's wheelbase should be based around the circumference of the rear tire. In some basic explaining through the years in magazine articles, he said he believed this because one rotation of the tire would move the car exactly one full wheelbase ahead. To him, this was as normal as you or I drinking water or breathing to stay alive. It simply made sense because it, well, made sense. Now, as we know, as the power levels were coming up in the sport, these cars are smoking the tires for longer and longer distances down the strip, so the one tire rotation moving the car forward one wheelbase kind of goes out the window. The cars are also starting to pull wheelies more and more frequently. And believe it or not, the Stubby Design is one that even through the late 1960s, Fenn claimed was the best way to do it. But we're going to get there in a second. The man was nothing if not passionate about the stuff he seemingly made up out of thin air. I got to give him credit for that. Business, like it was in 1959, was hardly able to be contained. Hundreds and hundreds more cars left the shop and the parts were flying out as well. The orders were rolling in, the machines were still winning at tracks at large and small across the country. Scotty Fenn was one of the recognized kings of drag racing. He was seemingly always qualified as the, quote, fiery or, quote, free-thinking mind in various stories, but the dude was a quote machine, and his ads are often more entertaining than the actual content of the drag newspapers they ran in. Now let's take a second to really understand the business that Scotty Fenn had rocking at this time by looking at 1960 images from the shop, which appeared in many different magazines. It's kind of mind-boggling to think that this went from a home garage in 1958 to an enterprise of this size by 1960. Fenn did have partners that he never much mentioned. Dick McMullen, who would go on to be an amazingly successful publisher of magazines, and machinist Dick Holt, who invested in the company for a 30% stake. He ran the very busy machining department that the company had filled with some of the best machine tools available at the time. Holt may have been the single busiest guy in the entire operation. Now, some of his competitors at the time tried to use Fenn's size against him, claiming that quality could only be achieved at small operations with a couple of guys doing all the work on the cars from start to finish. Fenn had a field day with this concept in his advertising, hammering home that the consistency of his cars winning major meets, setting records and dominating the sport proved that his factory was making stuff on the level of any artisanal shop. There was one thing that seemed a bit odd as the 1960 racing year worked its way to the end. Fenn had all but abandoned talking about his product. The ads mostly concentrated on taking shots at sanctioning bodies, track operators, and perhaps even his own competition in the industry. And as dominating a position as he sat, the man may have actually felt invincible. In fact, I know he did, because when 1961 rolled around, Scotty Fenn, at the height of his powers, was about to make the largest mistake of his life. Before he managed that gaffe, though, there were some signs that Fenn was starting to become more experimental, but perhaps not in the ways he needed to be. Take a look at this insane creation he built as a testbed with new theories with the Sear and Hopper team. This was a rear-mounted sidewinder dragster using a quick-change-style differential, two slicks basically touching each other, and all the looks of a truly deadly ride. Apparently the thing was largely undrivable, with the rear end trying to pass the front on many runs, but it did touch 170 a time or two before it was discarded. Fenn was also working on a car that would ultimately never be finished. The side-by-side rear-mounted twin small-block Chevy dragster would have been a true spectacle if it had ever seen the light of day, but alas, it didn't. One cannot ever know what was going through Scotty Fenn's mind when he finished writing a piece he entitled, quote, An Open Letter to Wally Parks, which ran in mid-February in the pages of Drag News. This was the country's largest circulating weekly drag newspaper. Was he nervous? Maybe smugly satisfied? One thing I am sure of, he wasn't fearing for the future of his high-flying business. He should have been. This letter contained 20 questions and all were aimed dead square at Wally Parks. These were not questions in the traditionally curious sense. The first one, quote, when did you invent the sport of drag racing? End quote, set the tone. The rest like, quote, what happened to the $22,000 in the Caballo Fund? Is it true you left a $14,000 paving bill in Great Bend? What is the secret in you being able to get people to slave away while you rake in the loot? End quote. And this went on and on and on through the entire story. Parks and Fenn, who had been locked in a Cold War of sorts over the last few years, had finally turned their battle public, and Scotty kicked off the first salvo. Undoubtedly, he expected some sort of response from Parks, but there's no way he saw it coming with the ferocity and decimating effect that it did. The first response from Parks was being handed a summons to court. He was being sued and sued for a very, very significant sum. The suit was filed by Robert J. Gottlieb, a man who served as the chief counsel for Robert E. Peterson, Peterson publishing the NHRA and Wally Parks. Secondarily, on March 19th, Parks responded to all of the questions, one by one and in depth, on the pages of both Drag News and the NHRA's National Dragster in a piece called, quote, Let's All Play 20 Questions. The following week, Fenn ran a strange, for him anyway, kind of backpedaling mea culpa, hey, I was just kind of kidding, style advertisement, apparently trying to bring the temperature of the whole situation down. It did nothing to slow down the legal monster that he had awoken. Whether by design or for other reasons, Chassis Research's name all but vanished from the pages of Drag News after that ad. From what was a weekly presence to virtually nothing outside of a smattering of small ads through 1961. My theory? Drag News was also likely somehow involved legally, or at least threatened in the whole Fenn Parks mess, and it didn't see the benefit in poking the bear. Interestingly, as Fenn's advertising shrunk, other chassis building outfits, which were springing up all over the country, swooped in to fill the space. Despite the outside issues, Chassis Research, on the momentum they had developed, continued to be the dominant name in the game in 1961. Sure, other cars were coming out, cars that were more flexible and some with longer wheelbases, some using engineering principles not removed from thin air, and some that were starting to make these Chassis Research machines look aged, but the reality was, like Henry Ford with the Model T, Scotty Fenn was convinced he had designed and his company was building the perfect dragster. Nothing needed to change, ever. Then a bombshell. In a November 1961 issue of National Dragster, an apology was published. Not an apology for a mistake in a story, an apology from Scotty Fenn himself. That's how you know this was bad. When a guy like Fenn, who lived on the attack, who was constantly on the verbal and grammatical offense, had to capitulate. This is the actual apology, and here's how it read. Quote, in February 1961, Mr. Scott Fenn published and distributed, quote, an open letter to Wally Parks, end quote, president of the National Hot Rod Association. This letter was based on unfounded rumors and, in the opinion of many, cast reflection upon the integrity of Mr. Parks. Quote, feeling that the insinuations were untrue, Robert J. Gottlieb, attorney for National Hot Rod Association, instituted an action against Fenn on behalf of Parks. Depositions of Fenn and Parks were taken. After the depositions and prior to trial, a settlement was reached. Mr. Parks dismissed the lawsuit against Mr. Fenn. As part of the consideration for the dismissal, Mr. Fenn signed a statement dated November 1, 1961, which reads in part, I therefore desire to publicly withdraw all of my questions, and I do herewith extend my apologies to Mr. Parks, the National Hot Rod Association, and all others who may have been offended by my action. End quote. Ugh. A settlement was reached? Of course, the most humbling of the language from the settlement was chosen to be published here to really dump some salt into Fenn's wounds. It seems that this settlement had a crippling effect on the business of chassis research in 1962. Outwardly, the company, which had produced more than 1,700 cars at this point, seemed okay, but inwardly there were problems. Production slowed to a crawl, staffing shrunk down, and despite new products like the LW106 chassis and the FL44 rear-engine chassis and continued refinements of the parts department, chassis research was in trouble. Let's take a moment to check out the chassis research catalog at this time period to understand how far down the road to lasting success Fenn was when he sunk the whole thing with one foolish public attack on the most powerful figure in the sport at the time. The company was honestly an industrial marvel of drag racing in this time period. We can see the various chassis offerings, the small parts and pieces, but when we get to the sections that detail the various bits and pieces that were cast for the company and finished machined in-house, it really is mind-blowing. It was a little-known fact that Fenn was not only building drag racing cars, but he also offered a modified Sportsman stock car racing chassis for that crowd as well. I have no idea if anybody bought any of those cars, but they were available for the buying if you wanted one. The FL44 rear-engine car, of which it seems only a single one was produced, was successful. The one car went to the Coleman Brothers Speed Shop in Maryland and ran very, very well with a blown small block Chevy tucked behind the driver. This thing regularly stopped all comers on the East Coast, setting speed strip records and ET records in the 180-mile-an-hour range. Fenn was always concerned about keeping his prices as low as possible for the lower-budget racers to be able to afford his products. His theory, one of the few that really made a lot of sense, was that American high schools were graduating hundreds of thousands of potential new customers each and every spring. Staying as the affordable option would allow those inspired young guys to get one of his chassis and some of his parts. Fenn was obsessive about safety as well. He had his chassis tested by engineering firms to see what kind of stresses and impacts they'd survive, and he published the results. It is one of his most enduring characteristics, and it was that obsession with safety. It is still amazing to me that this guy who ran an artist colony in Hawaii had the wherewithal and guts as well as the instincts to build this company into what it was at this moment in time. There was nothing else in the sport like it, and frankly, it would be a long time before there was anything to match it. Dick Holt, who was a partner of Fenn's, has publicly stated that Fenn's life outside the shop was anything but traditional. He had converted the backyard of his house into a kind of sealed-off zoo display that he had populated with large and a growing collection of monkeys. That house is just a few doors down from the workshop where all this madness was being made, and as you can see, the monkeys apparently visited the shop as well. Holt also reported that mail began arriving to the shop addressed to a, quote, Dr. Fenn. Creepy? Yeah, and this is not going to be the first time, nor the last time, he starts adding titles to his name in this story. Now, as Fenn's business fortunes were hitting the skids in 1962, his public profile rose again. Popular Hot Rodding magazine launched, and in the very first issue, his company, which was in the process of actively failing at that time, was profiled and his operation featured on the pages of the new book. A wild three-wheel dragster he had built for Kenny Ellis was also featured in the magazine, and lo and behold, Scotty Fenn then decided to become a journalist. He started writing tech articles on stuff like superchargers, flywheels, and other subjects. Using his same acerbic and aggressive style, he didn't necessarily inform the readers as much as he attacked them, abused them, and seemingly called them stupid. But the thing is, the stories are great. Even when what he is saying makes no sense at all, it's still fun to read. Editors clearly realized that while he didn't speak with any real legitimate reasoning, he was authoritative enough that it would surely engage readers. The most outlandish thing they let him do in 1962 was to write a car feature on a car that he had built. He bragged all over the R16 chassis and roadster from Michigan and all the stuff it had won, how smart the owners were, and how they truly were the best because they didn't mess with his perfect chassis at all and simply trusted in his brilliance to allow them to go win races. The closing line of this story is the absolute capper. It's kind of incredible that they'd allow a guy to write a story about a car he actually built. It's horribly self-serving, but I'm guessing Scotty worked cheap and they needed the pages filled. By 1963, Chassis Research was out of business. A combination of the lawsuit, a refusal to change and update designs, and perhaps other outside factors brought a stunning end to a business that had all the promise of being a decades-long industry leader. With the right leadership, this company could have stayed ahead of the pack for a long, long time. Chassis Research was liquidated to a few different directions. Elko Manufacturing, a neighboring business and large aftermarket concern, got some of the parts and pieces as well as the foundry deals to keep producing many individual parts that Chassis Research had been making. The Coleman Brothers Speed Shop in Maryland bought a lot of inventory and shipped it east, and Elko also decided to continue manufacturing the LW106 chassis and offering some parts to the other chassis for older cars. For many people, this is where the Scotty Fenn story ends. His moment in the sun over, the company gone, he disappeared. Except he didn't. Supposedly, according to Dick Holt and a couple others, Fenn went to work as a clerk at a camera store for a short time after the closure and liquidation of the company. When people found him, they asked him about unpaid bills and invoices, and he directed them to his wife, Jean, to go figure it out. Amazingly, at some point, Fenn talked the Coleman Brothers Speed Shop guys in Maryland to hire him. The main reason? He was going to build them a dyno. Yes, this third and final act of the Scotty Fenn story is marked by the same thing the first two were marked by, the construction of a dyno, and it will end the same way. By all accounts, the Maryland experiment was a disaster. By the time Fenn was back in California in 1965, there was a pile of assorted parts that were pretending to be a dyno at the Coleman Brothers shop, but none of it ever worked. While working in the East, Fenn continued to crank magazine stories on everything from chassis design to safety, aerodynamics, traction, and the list goes on and on. Every story was a massive collection of words, some pretty scientific sounding, but all were seemingly light on actual data and information. Scotty's writing style was very much of the, quote, if you can't dazzle him with facts, baffle him with BS. If you didn't understand what he was saying, you likely weren't smart enough. He called the long wheelbase evolution of drag racing cars an idiotic theory, espoused the benefits of, you guessed it, dynos for tuning, and did something else pretty interesting. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, in the middle 1960s, in typical Scotty Fenn fashion, his byline started to carry engineering credentials. Suddenly it was Scotty Fenn SAE, or Scotty Fenn ASTM, etc., or both and more. Did he get an engineering degree all of a sudden? I don't think so. And I know that because the last interview of consequence with Scotty Fenn came in 1965. Terry Cook conducted the interview for Drag World magazine, and what's wild here is that a couple of years back, Cook was actually a popular hot rodding reader who wrote letters to the editor questioning Fenn's tech articles and what the engineering was rooted in. Talk about full circle. So Cook caught up with Fenn after he got wind that he was working, likely as a machinist, for Anson Automotive, one of the largest automotive aftermarket companies of the era. Now, the interview is bizarre. Fenn claims that the lawsuit didn't run him out of business, but rather a series of heart attacks, 3 in fact over the course of 4 months in the 1962 timeframe, caused him to close shop and not die on the job. He insults racers like Sneaky Pete Robinson, disavows all 200-mile-an-hour runs as being fake, attacks the sanctioning bodies, and, well, here's a few of the more notable questions and answers. Question by Terry Cook. You appear to be quite a drag racing philosopher. Answer from Fenn. Yes, I'm a philosopher and I've got the scars to prove it. Question. What do you plan on doing in the future? Fenn's answer. I know where there's a half mountain full of emeralds and someday I'm going to go dig them up. Question. Changing the subject, what do you think of modern trends in chassis design incorporating the flexible chassis and lightweight theories? Fenn. Why do these guys think that this flexi chassis business is the answer, when I had the answer with my front suspension back in 1956? I wouldn't know a Woody car if I stumbled across one. Everybody says that my cars are too heavy, but just look at these cars today. They're made out of light, thin mailing tubing. You have to hang a bunch of lead on the front end to keep the nose down. Question. What do you think of all these 200-mile-an-hour runs today? Fenn. All phonies. The cars aren't running any faster than 160 miles per hour. Do you know how fast 200 miles per hour is? Do you know that if you attached a rope to the push bar of a dragster and lifted it up with a helicopter to a distance of 1/4 of a mile, sliced the rope, it would take 9.6 seconds for it to fall and hit the ground? End quote. Question. If I recall correctly, didn't you once theorize that the optimum wheelbase of a dragster should be equal to the circumference of one of the rear slicks that it uses? Fenn. Yes, I feel that this is the way cars should be built when determining wheelbase, because a car ideally moves forward the distance of one slick circumference when the tire's not slipping. Question. I can see some correlation between the two factors, but what about the idea that the slick is spinning and smoking for a certain percentage of the run, ruling out your relationship? Fenn. You don't understand. It's too complicated. Do you know that I was the person who pioneered the idea of pointing the engine down in the chassis? Also, I was told I was crazy when I put between 34 and 42 degrees of caster on the front ends of my cars. Today, that is a standard. As for this modern chassis theory concerning flexi frames and short wheelbase cars doing wheelies, do you know there's no such thing as weight transfer? Question. Changing the subject, what is your opinion of the present-day associations such as the NHRA, AHRA, and UDRA? Fenn. I don't think any of them are worth anything. NHRA doesn't do anything for anybody. AHRA is just a bunch of farmers. I see no need for association. I see nothing to be gained by belonging to either of these groups. End quote. The interview was truly bizarre, and it continued with other such factoids as him suggesting Pete Robinson take his car to Africa and see what tribesmen thought of it, and other incredibly strange answers. But Fenn did continue to contribute to magazines like Drag Racing, Drag Strip, Modern Rod, and Popular Hot Rodding through the 1967 publishing year. And then, poof, kind of. It seems that he split from his wife Jean during the period between closing chassis research and his prolific freelancing, moving to Maryland and back and assuming regular work. One can hazard a guess that he worked as a machinist or in other capacities for aftermarket companies for some years, and then in 1976, he reemerges. Scotty Fenn was operating a company called the Dragon Enterprise in Gardena, California. Classified ads seeking qualified help and announcing sales are about the only record of the small shop that apparently was a speed shop, a general service of body and repair work as well. I couldn't determine an opening year, but it seems like it would have been prior to 1976. Either way, we can place him at the Dragon Enterprise until 1982. That's when Gordon Alfred Fenn, known to many as Scotty, died at the age of 62 years in Lawndale, California. He was survived by his daughter Leilani and his son Rock, who were both born in Hawaii. Rock lived far away in Alabama, while his daughter lived in San Pedro, California. There is no mention of Gene Fenn in his small obituary. Scotty Fenn was inducted into the International Drag Racing Hall of Fame in 1996. No one came on his behalf to accept the award. Thus ends the tale of Scotty Fenn, a life unlike few others in the history of drag racing. Fenn was part genius, part huckster, part pathological liar, part visionary, and ultimately fascinating. Scotty knew exactly what the young sport of drag racing needed in the late 1950s, and people ate it up. Had he been able to exert a little more control over himself, the name Chassis Research may stand with some of the other epic brands of the day that not only survived but continue to thrive inside and outside of drag racing. They only made one Scotty Fenn, and in the end, that's probably a good thing. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more historical people, cars, trucks, machines, and innovations in motorsports and beyond. Along with those things, the occasional fascinating life that can both be inspirational on one hand and a cautionary tale on the other. The end.